Here's a few items of business, good and welfare. I've added to your list of readings this article by Korzybski called The Role of Language in the Perceptual Process, 1943, and you can get it online. Just take that right in, it should come up right away. So you can add that to your reading of the chapters and selections from Science and Sanity. And the task that I'll be assigning later relating to the readings in Science and Sanity will also include this one. Just sort of slap it into Science and Sanity as if it were part of it. And the other item I wanted to make sure that I was explicit about is that you should keep all your tasks. When I return them to you, you should keep them as marked, because I'm not keeping a record of the marks. And at the end of the term, you're going to put them all together, and that'll be your journal. And you can submit that to me, and I'll be able to review your work. And I'll tell you later about exactly how to do this. The main thing now is to keep the tasks, not to lose track of them between now and the first week of December. All right. Now, today I hope to be able to have time to assign two tasks that are silent practice tasks next to final two silent practice tasks. One of them will be, I abbreviate it this way, relating to continuous silent practice. And the other one will have to do with let's say, looking at a person. I'm hesitating before saying looking, but because you'll also be listening and feeling. But let's just call it looking at a person. Now, as I mentioned last time, the idea of silent practice is not just to be able to examine little objects like teacups carefully and to describe them precisely in sensory-guided language. That's just the first step. I'm going to skip over some intervening tasks because time is short and go right to the last. You'll see how these two actually could go together, or should maybe go together in some way. Continuous silent practice. Well, let's start with a quote from Korzybski says, "Always dwell on the silent level." Not just when you're looking at a teacup, but always. And of course, we should never say always, because one of the key negative tenets of general semantics is non-allness. Yes. So we should revise that form and say as frequently as possible. Dwell on the silent level. Look, listen, and I would add feel. And this gives you a little bit of an idea of what we're about right now, but he doesn't tell you how to do this. Maybe he thinks that's enough, but I think it would be worth going into detail on it a little bit. Especially maybe because I've had access to the, again, from Buddhism, the various practices of what they call mindfulness meditation, which have all sorts of instructions or suggestions that are relevant here. So, drawing freely on that, I'm going to describe for you how to do that, how to dwell as frequently as possible at the silent level. And I should also add, as I said before, that the silent level for Korzybski means non-verbal. Doesn't mean to exclude sound, because sound is an important part of our sensory experience at the non-verbal level. So, very simply, or maybe not so very simply, let's start with the observation that in our normal state of consciousness, is a sort of jumble of perceptions of happenings outside the skin and perceptions of thoughts and feelings that are going on inside the skin. So that, for example, maybe for a long time, people have been saying to you that the problem is that you don't listen. How many times has someone, especially someone you love, told you that your problem is that you don't listen?
I don't know, I wasn't paying attention.
They're always listening, of course. It's you who don't listen. It's like that old algorithm for couple therapy. If not for you, this would be a perfect relationship. So what does it mean, really? They say, what do you mean? Well, what is meant by this usually is that you're listening to your own thoughts and your own internal dialogue and your own chatter. And that this is, at the very least, interrupting and in some ways blocking out completely your hearing of what there is to hear. In the case of this anecdote, it would be what the other person is saying. So we could say that usually our experience is a jumble. I'll notate it that way. So this is what's going on outside, external. And this is what's going on inside, internal. That's it. Look and you'll see. And it is an E. I finally figured out what the purpose of these sleeves are. It's to create a greater possibility that this thing is just going to fall right on your hands and spill the tea all over.
I always thought they were barista armbands. Yeah.
Right. So actually what we're going to do is, you might say artificially, and we're talking about practice, we're going to artificially separate those two streams of happenings. One of them will be internal and the other one will be external. And how are we going to do that? We're going to direct our attention to what's going on outside the skin. At least, I won't get into the critique of the notion that anything actually is going on outside the skin. In the common sense sort of approach, what's going on outside the skin. So look. So you put your attention into looking. In your first silent practice task, you put your attention into looking at a screwdriver or something like that, or an alfalfa leaf. But in continuous silent practice, that is continuous both in the spatial and in the temporal sense, it's continuous spatially, see as much as you can see. Look and see as much as you can comfortably see. So you do that for a bit until you have the sense that you've seen just about as much as you can take, as far as might be fun, what you can see around you. Without interruption from, for example, internal images. But often what happens when we're looking is we look at someone, for example, and it reminds us of our Uncle Schmo, and then we have an internal image of our Uncle Schmo. So the question is, did we see who we're looking at, or did we see some kind of composite of that unfortunate person and our Uncle Schmo? Okay, and then listen. And pick up on sounds. Give your attention to external sounds. By the way, just to break it down a little bit, if you're one of these people who has trouble falling asleep, because your great intellectual minds are full of epistemological discourse while you're trying to fall asleep, then many of us have found that a good remedy for that is to direct your attention to the external sounds that are available to you. The sounds of sirens, screams of people being murdered across the street, cats yelling, that kind of stuff that's happening out there. And to keep bringing your attention back to the external sounds. And then feel. Now I think this is perhaps more important than you might think. For one thing, when the question arises, well, what's the difference between external, internal? I mean, there is no feeling outside the skin, so it's not really, the division between external and internal no longer strictly applies, but it still roughly applies in this sense that the actual body, if I may use such a locution, the actual body can be felt as opposed to the sort of rumblings that are going on within it. Let's say in various emotional vectors or sensations relating to internal thought, kind of thing. And it's important in continuous silent practice to have a kind of anchor. Otherwise you can spin out there too. You can spin out on external sights and sounds. So you remember what I was showing you maybe last week or the week before about the breath? So if you keep, as you're doing this, you put part of your attention on the breath. Let's say, I don't know, 20%, are you into precision? And the rest of your attention, say 80% if you're into precision, just on the feeling of the solid body as a whole. At the object level. So you've practiced looking, and then you've practiced listening, and then you practiced feeling the body, kinesthetic body. And then you practice doing all of them simultaneously. So if you're paying attention to what is going on around you, that means you're paying attention to what can be seen, what can be heard, and also to the feeling of the body. For example, if you're doing this while walking, which is a good idea, and one of the most closely related practices in the Buddhist tradition is walking. And there's all different forms of walking meditation. Some of them are actually infuriating because you're instructed to notice every tiny movement of the leg as it comes up, every tiny movement as it comes down and hits the ground. Okay, so it could take you a very long time to get anywhere. But of course, from their perspective, the point is not to get anywhere. Anyhow. So I'm not going to be asking you to do anything like that. I'm going to be asking you simply to walk the way you usually do, but to be aware of the movement as you're walking. So as I'm walking, I'm seeing and hearing and I'm feeling my body walking. It's a good way of feeling the body because I'm feeling my body walking. It's like movement. Let's say breath and the solid body and movement. So, I've practiced this long enough so that you might think I'm not the epitome of enlightenment, but just ask yourself how crazy I would be if I hadn't been practicing some of these things. It's all relative. So I can't write on the board without hearing. And I can't walk down the street usually, unless I'm really in dreamland, without feeling every step that I take on the ground and feeling my clothes hanging on my body. Have you ever paid attention to the feeling of your clothes hanging on your body?
Usually in winter.
Right on.
Or in summer when they stick to you.
Yes. Okay. Now, so there we have at least one component of this, but there's another component.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
Does Korzybski make this explicit, the left Buddhism?
No.
Okay, and then the other thing is the solid body. It's more like where
It's what you feel as you sit there,
okay.
not the event, the object.
Okay.
We can't practice up the event. We can't describe it, we can't practice there. We can only theorize about it. So what you were about to say was a theorization.
Well, it's
I mean, unless you can actually feel those molecules whirling around.
yeah.
Okay,
There
well-
are practices that.
Oh, well, that's good. Let's avoid that. Yeah. Okay, so this is what you're going to find. You're going to find that, and that was only a suggestion. I'm only a hypnotist. What you're going to find is that the more attention that you're able to give to what is outside the skin, the more you will become aware of what is going on inside. Now, in meditation practices, this is often pejoratively labeled distraction. Distraction. And you're supposed to come back to a meditation object from distraction. But in our practice, we become aware of thoughts, images, feelings, etc. that are going on inside the skin that would usually be all mixed up with what we're perceiving outside, and therefore we wouldn't be aware of them. When you do this, you're no longer sort of identified, if I may use that term, with them. You're no longer identified with them. You are aware of them. Just to give you one quick example, because it comes to mind, if you roll up your sleeve, you're not going to pinch yourself today, you'll just clench your fist. So if you clench your fist, or if you can't do that because you're an upper Canadian, just imagine that you're clenching your fist. Imagine that you're clenching your fist, and there's nothing political about it. You're just clenching your fist. And now study the feeling. And you can notice the difference between the feeling not studied and the feeling studied, or just the feeling and the awareness of the feeling. There's an of that intervenes there. Now, this is what Korzybski has to say about that. And this practice was very important to him, as a matter of fact, even though he doesn't go into detail about it. Maybe in their workshops they went into more detail. You almost get the feeling when he's being at his most enthusiastic that just this practice alone would save the world from war, capitalism, etc., etc. That's my feeling. He never actually said such a thing. But he gets so enthusiastic about it that it's almost as if he might have said something like that. He says that what he does say is this, that you will learn to have a fraction of a second of psychological delay. A fraction of a second. Or even quicker than that. A fraction of a second of psychological, and he hyphens there, psychological. I'm not exactly sure why. Delay. And this is related very closely to the whole idea of consciousness of abstraction. It's almost like to have that, to have the habit, to have trained yourself neuro-linguistically, to have the habit of, because you don't do it on purpose every fraction of a second. So it becomes habitual, of psychological delay. That is more or less, maybe not the same as, but very closely related to the notion of consciousness as abstraction. I'll say more about that soon. It's like the more aware you can become of, well, let's put it this way also. Here you are observing what's happening around you. Maybe it's It's just the ravine as you walk through it, and you're not paying attention to anything in particular, but to as much as possible there. Or maybe it's a person. That's what's going to happen here. Or maybe it's a person that you're interacting with in some way. So in that case, it's a person. And what you become aware of here is what Korzybski calls your semantic reaction, your meaning-making reaction. So here, what is going on? You're attending to what is going on. And by doing that automatically, you create what he calls a fraction of a second of psychological delay, or sometimes he calls it a pause, or we could call it a gap, and you can see it opening up here. A gap between what is happening outside the skin and your own reaction to it, your own semantic reaction, your meaning-making reaction to it. I'll give you an example later when I assign the second task, in which I give an example of myself doing it. I'm sitting in a coffee shop and I see a man whom I can describe more or less in secondary language speaking with a Russian accent, and my semantic reaction is Russian mafia. Okay? Now, maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, I don't know, and I don't care. Because at this juncture anyway, it's not about improving the accuracy of our evaluations. It's about learning the difference between what we see here and our evaluations of, or reactions to, or meaning-making reactions of what you see here. Now you see how close that is to the whole notion already of consciousness of abstraction. If I'm doing that, I'm conscious of abstraction. And Korzybski says, but don't worry about it, you can't do it all the time, he says. Even I cannot be conscious of abstraction all the time, and I wrote the book. By the way, in connection with Laura, with the question you raised about whether he knew about Buddhism, he would never admit to knowing anything about Buddhism, but some of the people in the movement did, and you could see these affinities, and they tried to discuss them with him. And his reaction was short and sweet, along the lines of, the worst thing you could possibly do is try to make me into a Buddha. Okay? He was a hard-headed Polish engineer, Count Korzybski, and no Buddha. If you meet that Buddha on the road, kill him. It's like, being able to draw like pictures and diagrams is so helpful. I couldn't do much of it in the history of political thought from Machiavelli to Marx, but I can in this course, and that's one of the reasons that I like it better. So in that kind of mixed up state, which is our normal state of consciousness, we could say natural, but not inevitable. Natural, but not inevitable. You could say that our awareness is immediately flooded, captured, and taken over by the semantic reaction. It's a Russian mobster, call the police. Or in the example I'm going to be giving later today, if I have time to get there, about something that regularly happens in the New York subway system when undercover cops see black men in plain clothes carrying guns, and they shoot them down because the semantic reaction is black men in plain clothes carrying gun equals criminal. I'll give you a little bit more chapter and verse later if we have time. Okay, so that's about accuracy, right? I'll repeat. We're not concerned here with accuracy. We're not concerned with tuning up our street smarts, which I would think a policeman in New York subway ought to be interested in. But that's not what we're interested in, not at this juncture, not in tuning up the street smarts, but in training in consciousness of abstraction. Of course, these two things are not unrelated, but they're not identical either. That fraction of a second gives you a moment, fraction of a second. It gives you a fraction of a second to be consciousness of, to be conscious of abstraction. You know, the only general semanticist after Korzybski that I have any respect for, Robert Kula, once suggested that instead of talking about consciousness of abstraction, we should talk about consciousness of abstracting. You know, later on, Laura, if we had time, which we don't, I would drag in industrial phenomenological reduction and describe how phenomenological reduction can be incorporated into general semantics in order to give one the sense that even one's sensory experience is an abstraction. We can't go there. So instead of the semantic reaction, instead of falling into your reaction and identifying yourself with it, for example, well, never mind the example. This space opens up around it. This space, this pause, this gap, this delay. So although your reaction is happening, you're not being asked to suppress it or ignore it or repress it. No repression. Repression is not. You're just being asked not to identify with it. Or not to, well, in Korzybski's language, not to identify the label level, or even more precisely, this level with the object. Now, it says I should go to page 71. All right, so Korzybski says that, and here he's talking again more about what's happening here. I could say about this one too here. I'm not the most patient person in the world, and I am susceptible to a little teeny bit of road rage. I'm sure no one in here has any idea what that's like, but I do. All I can say is I've become a lot better at it than some of my even more impatient friends. Because when this reaction is coming up, which is along the lines of how dare they and I'll show them, and the associated emotions, when this space opens up around it, and I say to myself, it's a lot more important for me to observe my reaction than to do anything about it. It's a lot more important for me at this moment to observe the reaction than to do anything about it. Like, for example, there's a black man, it's a lot more important for me to notice the quick assumption that I'm making and the intention to draw my gun and shoot. A lot more important to be aware of that than to take action on it. You might say, well, a cop has to make split-second decisions, but this is only a fraction of a second. Fraction of a second. That we're talking about. That is if you practice. And so Korzybski says, very quickly after saying, dwell, always dwell on a sound level, look, listen, etc., he says, be silent outwardly and inwardly, by which he means observe without comment what is going on outside the skin and what is going on inside the skin. If what's arising in here is an evaluation, I got to be silent about that too, because I could go, oh my God, I'm having another moment of road rage. What a stupid idiot I am, which would be an evaluation of the evaluation, which would make things even worse. So I become as silent, as impartial, you might almost say, observer, not only of what is going on around me, but also of my own reactions to it. An impartial observer, it's really weird, because in both Hindu and Buddhist meditation practices, this is called the witness. So it's as if you could put it this way, say if you wanted to use the language of more scientific cognitive psychology or behavioral psychology, you could say that through practice one constructs for oneself a function, a self-function of self-observation. Of course, there's all kinds of cognitive psychologists who do stuff like this for various purposes. Also, as a matter of fact, mindfulness meditation is becoming more and more popular among the cognitive psychotherapists as a remedy for depression. And I might as well tell you about this since one thing leads to another. There was a physician, formerly anyway, at the Harvard Medical School named John Kabat-Zinn. Maybe some of you even heard of him. He got that much play. who uses various forms of mindfulness meditation for all sorts of medical and proto-medical purposes. And he's got a big book about it called Full Catastrophe Living. Full Catastrophe Living. Now, it's been interesting from that point of view because if my reaction here is, oh my God, which is our, I don't know how many times a day we have that reaction, oh my God, then we're just going, oh my God, and we're not going, oh my God, about that, and then another, oh my God, about that, which will create, if you persist, a panic attack. So just like, to quote the best-selling self-help book about anxiety, feel the fear and do it anyway. So you just feel the fear, you don't become fearful of the fear, or fearful of the fear of the fear, or angry about the fear of the fear of the fear. And so when someone performing this kind of function that I'm performing here talks about self-observation, then those who hear him talking about third person, those who hear him are like, oh, self-observation, yeah, I do that all the time. Nobody has to tell me to observe myself. But usually what people mean when they say that they observe themselves, that they're talking to themselves about themselves, evaluating themselves, judging themselves, condemning themselves, praising themselves, encouraging themselves, blah, 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 blah. But awareness is empty. It has no content. It's just this empty space in which these object-level happenings are allowed to arise. And that's exactly the way, again, some Buddhists talk about it. They won't even say that I am aware. They will say that these things are arising, these happenings are arising in naked, empty awareness. Now, of course, those of us who are unfortunately too intelligent will find it very difficult to prevent this from spinning out. So the point is not to go to a place where you say, oh my God, I can't do it. I'm a failure. I'm a loser. I will never become even one iota saner. To assign it as a task, I would say find a portion of space-time where you can do this. A good time is when you're en route from one important duty to another. Usually when we're en route from one important duty to another, that's when your mind is spinning out like, with Jesus, the most inane stuff often. Sometimes it's very interesting. But anyway, that's a good time to practice. Practice. Look, listen, feel. By the way, when you are spinning out, it's very useful to have been practicing consciousness of the body, because if you come back to the body, come back to the breath, it's really easy to come back to the body, come back to the breath as a kind of way of getting back to that kind of awareness. Okay, so we've come a long way from staring at a screwdriver and describing it in precise sense of grand language. It's time for me to talk about the New York subway deal. I used to devote a good half of a class to this bit because it's really so interesting. There's miscreants, so we can focus our anger on I used to call it as a silent practice for cops. Forget about it. It's just that this happened in the New York subway system. And I already told you more or less what happened. I got a lot of details on it. If you're curious enough, if you Google Peter Del Debbio, you'll probably come up with a story from the New York Times. This is the unfortunate white policeman who got into trouble for shooting a black undercover cop in the New York subway system because he thought that he must be a criminal because he was a black man carrying a gun. At least that's the official story. As you can imagine, the more controversy there is and hearings and trials and so on, the more different versions of the story you get. But that's enough for us here. There's no Goldstone Commission on the New York subway system yet. Anyway, there's a bit of kerfuffle, but what it ends up with, for me, is this. And this is actually from Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, which, at least some of you I can see already have heard of it. So it's from pages 232 to 33 of Gladwell's book, Blink. Gladwell recounts the work of a psychologist named Keith Payne, who sat people down and who was working with police trying to deal with the problems, what we could loosely call racial profiling in settings like that in the New York subway system. They're breaking their heads trying to figure out a way of getting better behavior out of those cops. All sorts of sensitivity training, and no, you shouldn't do that, and that's bad, racism is bad, learning black history, all kinds of stuff like this. But nothing really works. I mean, the thing just goes on happening. Right? I mean, the thing does just go on happening. And so Payne is working with the computer screen where he's flashing pictures of black people and white people on the screen. And there are the pictures that are flashing very quickly. And a picture of a white man carrying a wrench, people will see a white man carrying a wrench. But if it's a black man carrying a wrench, a significant number of subjects will report seeing a black man carrying a weapon. Okay? So they project the weapon onto the wrench. And that's an example, like in the psych lab, an example of the kind of mental process that is happening there in the subway system where somebody gets shot. The image is on the screen for 200 milliseconds. If you saw, well, I won't give you the detail. The point is this, that Payne has tried all kinds of techniques, says Gladwell, to reduce this bias. For example, warning subjects that their behavior will be watched by other subjects, which makes them even worse. Or does that surprise you? Or just telling them to avoid stereotypes. But it didn't matter. The only thing that made a difference, Payne found, was forcing people to wait a bit before identifying the object on the screen. They needed to see. And Gladwell underlines see. They needed to see. So we could say this is a little bit of an inadvertent discovery of something like silent practice in the psychology lab with those learning pay at the New York Police Department. But nobody there, and Gladwell also has not heard of Korzybski or General Semantics or silent practice. I could be wrong, but there's no indication to me that anyone in the NYPD or being a psychologist or Gladwell has heard of silent practice or General Semantics. So what does that mean? Well, what it means, among other things that it could mean, is that for these people who are working with cops, etc., and Gladwell is publishing stuff about it, there is no broader political, civilizational implication. And that's exactly what there is in General Semantics. Whereas this, and especially in my version of it, which is Radical General Semantics, this is what it's all about from from our perspective. That broader, we won't even call it political, let's call it civilizational perspective. Because if I say political, you might think I'm lining up with some kind of a left and some kind of a right, but I've just about had my fill of it. It goes on long enough to have your fill of it. Okay. Desmond Robinson was the black undercover officer who was shot there on August the 22nd, 1994. I'm just so tempted to give you more of the story. I should pause here and see if there's any question or comment, especially a question about this task. Is that as I've assigned it? Yeah.
I probably just missed it. But we're supposed to be observing the things around us, not our own, just the things outside our skin for this task, right?
No.
No?
Good that you
Oh,
asked because
okay.
because I can repeat. See, let's say after class I'm going to the ballet. I've decided to walk because that would be the green thing to do. Okay? So on the way to ballet, it's going to be a 20-minute walk. So on the way to the ballet, I look at, I try and see as much of what there is to see around me, whether pleasant or not. Hear as much of what there is to hear around me, whether pleasant or not. Maintain awareness of my own breath and body moving through space, moving through terrain. And at the same time, I'm going to be aware of semantic reactions, meaning-making reactions that are coming up inside the skin. I'm aware of them, so they're arising in awareness. Like, oh my God, I should have taken a taxi, or, I hate ballet anyway, and I'm just going there because I feel that I should, or just completely inane and irrelevant trouble, which is usually what we spend most of our time on, right? So you become aware of it. Yeah.
So it's more like an internal dialogue.
It's often internal dialogue. However, that favors the sound channel a little bit more than is appropriate for some people who just hallucinate with the imagery. Or they combine, they have full-fledged movie. Or, some people who are really into their bodies, into the insides of their bodies, the guts and so on. On that 20-minute walk, they have all kinds of mysterious gut feelings. Right? So, there's options. We've got options. When we're looking at a person, this is not like looking at an object, It's like miles and miles away. So we're looking at a person out there. And at the same time, of course, we're having thoughts, meanings, evaluations. Let's use the term stories. We're looking at a person, and as we look at a person, we have stories about the person. And usually, again, in the normal state of consciousness, our story about the person is immediately identified with the person. Right? And it might not be wrong. That's not the point. The point is not that the evaluation might be wrong. It might be more or less wrong, more or less right. That's not what we're concerned with here. Again, we're concerned with the style and practice, consciousness of abstraction. Not with how good the abstraction is, but just consciousness of abstraction. So I'm looking at the person and I'm aware of the stories. So what's the task? Well, I'm aware of the stories. That is, I'm aware of thoughts and images that I'm having, and that's what a story is. It's a compound of thoughts and images. If you can think of any other component of the story, please let me know. Words and images in the mind. That's what it is. But there's also this, let's just call it gut reaction. The kind I was talking about before when we talked about road rage. Okay. So back to the road rage scene. So if I direct, instead of acting from the feeling, I observe the feeling. Then I can, as I observe it, I can notice that it is hard to describe, and it's something like tightening, cold, tightening, muscle tightening, and chill in the chest. Right? So I keep my attention focused on that. And I can notice the interaction between the thoughts and images and the sort of feeling, the emotional feeling it's called. There's a difference between the feeling of the body per se and the emotional feeling, which is in there, in there somewhere between here and there. Maybe some people feel love in their toes. I don't know. So part of it is noticing the interaction here. The interaction is usually of a vicious circle nature. Right? The more I tell myself Russian mafia, the more I feel Russian mafia, the more I see him as Russian mafia, and I'm verging on the example now. So, for the task, I describe the person in ordinary descriptive English, but now I want to change a little bit the definition of ordinary descriptive English. I'll do it as we go along. You see, in ordinary descriptive English, maybe if I said Russian gangster, some people would say, well, that's ordinary descriptive English. I mean, he's wearing gold chains, he's wearing expensive clothes. He's got to be a Russian gangster. I mean, what Russian would have gold chains and expensive clothes who's not a gangster? Just an innocent question. That's what freedom means. When freedom came to the former Soviet Union, that's what it turned out to have meant. Who knew? Who could have guessed? What democracy would have brought to the former Soviet Union. So you pay attention at the object level. What does this mean? This comes down to really noticing stuff that you would ordinarily not notice very much. Really noticing facial expressions, changes in facial expressions, postures, gestures, noticing gestures, tones of voice, movement, right? Behavior, noticing as precisely as possible the elements of behavior and the changes of behavior, and to describe that in as neutral a language as possible. That's what I mean by ordinary descriptive English this time. Some people would call it a video description. In listening or reading your description of this person that you're observing, I should be able to get as close as possible in my imagination to seeing what you were seeing. So that's a video description. As if you could broadcast directly into my mind what you were seeing. Just what you were seeing. Okay? Maybe someday we'll have a technology about it. That would be a nightmare. And allowing the stories to come to mind. But you've got that separation happening. You're looking at the person and you're allowing the stories to come to mind. You're not buying the stories. So here's my example. I've already given you part of it. I'm sitting in a coffee shop. In fact, it's in Forest Hill Village because this actually happened. So I'm sitting in a coffee shop, and I notice a well-dressed, well, that isn't exactly ordinary descriptive English. There's some evaluation there in the well-dressed, or what is well-dressed? But we'll let it go. We'll let it go because we got to use our common sense and our judgment in working on this task. So we want to keep it as close to a video description as possible, but since we don't actually have the technology yet, we have to allow ourselves a certain leeway. To call him well-dressed. White hair and beard. Middle-aged, well, there's another problematic one. I mean, how do we know how old a person is by looking at it? I mean, we know. The question is, how do we know? And we're not going to take the time to describe in sensory grounded language the wrinkles in his forehead and big bags under his eye. Besides, some 18-year-olds could have wrinkles in the bags too. So, but we'll let it go. We'll let that go too. Middle age. He's a well-dressed, middle-aged, or we could say apparently middle-aged. Now you're already seeing it, aren't you? And as a matter of fact, your picture is going beyond what I've already said. You're filling it in on your own, aren't you? You could very well be. And white hair and beard. Nodding his head vigorously. Okay. Speaking loudly. You choose to say speaking loudly rather than shouting. All right. How many times again in your love situation does someone say to you, stop yelling at me, and you say, I'm not yelling. Okay? How many times? All right. I was speaking loudly. Well, that is actually closer to sensory grounded language. So he's speaking loudly and quickly, talking about business with a Russian accent. I love that accent, by the way. Russian accent. Mentioning large sums of money. Mentioning large sums of money. And coughing. Okay? This is all the ordinary descriptive English video description. His hands are covered, at first I wrote, with age spots. But then I revised that to brown spots. Okay, you see how brown spots is less evaluative than age spots? Closer to the object level. His shoes are tattered. Well, that's an exception to the well-dressed thing. He's got a blue cashmere sweater, which is hanging down around him. I forgot to put the gold chains in here. He's got those gold chains which have replaced membership in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union as the obligation. The sweater, although expensive looking, is also looking old. Well, again, how do I know it's old? I'm not going to try and put it into real sensory grounded language. So I'll give myself the leeway. It's like old. Actually, there's a quaver in his voice. You see, so as you pay attention, you'll notice more and more little distinctions and qualifications to what you thought you saw at first. First, I thought the voice was just loud and aggressive, and now I can hear the quaver. Okay, so when I do the task, that will be part one. Or I'll share with Horowitz the stories that were coming to mind. And you already know more or less, but I'll read to you what we've got here, what I've got here, the stories that come to mind based on those cues. I'm not making it up, they're based on sensory cues. So the story that comes to mind is he's a wealthy Russian businessman. He's buying, he's selling hard. He's really manipulative. He's really full of himself. He's perhaps an oligarch. Yeah. Yeah, there's a little bit of gut reaction there. We could describe it as nausea, incipient nausea, right? And the more I tell myself the story, maybe the more nauseated I'm going to feel, and the more convinced I become of the truth of my story, because how could I be nauseated except by someone who is nauseated? How is it possible to be nauseated except by someone who is nauseated? Isn't that the first rule of political science? Well, but the quaver in his voice. Maybe he's not so confident. Maybe he's fearful, or maybe he's both confident and fearful. The tattered shoes, the old sweater, maybe he's not so rich. Maybe he's lost all his money. Maybe that's why he's so intense. I wrote this before the stock market crash. Maybe he's lost all his money. So the story can go, it can go. And, hey, it's a good story. But the point of the practice is, again, to practice noticing the difference between what we might call the object level, which is, you know, it's not just seeing, but it's pretty close to just seeing. And this level here, where the label and the object experience are so closely soldered together, we can call them seeing as. So part one is about what I see, and part two is about what I see, and of course hear. The hearing is happening here also, as seeing as. And if in part two you want to open up, I mean it's more or less optional, if you want to open up a part three here, which will describe that cycling between story and sort of visceral feelings. I'll say visceral, etc. Because you know, here's an aside. When you're doing the first sound practice task, it's interesting to keep some of your awareness in your head. I mean literally in your physical head, in your face, in the feeling of your head, like behind your eyes, in the small muscles in your face. It's pretty hard to spin out if you're in your body. And we forget that the head is an important part of the body. And that there's a lot of computation, actually, that is going on in the small muscles of the face. So, you know, when people screw up their faces, it's not just because they're expressing an emotion, they're actually computing at a nonverbal level in such a way. Yeah.
Personally, I find hands to be very grounding. There's just a lot of tension here, but hands are generally just vibrant on the inside.
Okay. And different people will find different things. But for me, it was a revelation one day about 10 years ago to feel my head. Oh my God. It's a head. It's there. It's a skull. It's not just blah, blah, blah. CCC. So if the cops, back to the cops, if the New York cops practice this one, I mean really practice this one, would that do it for them? Would it reduce the number of unnecessary deaths? We forgot the necessary deaths. Would it reduce the number of unnecessary deaths in the New York subway system? Well, we'll never find out without a controlled experiment. And they ain't going to do that. So it's like silent practice for cops, forget about it. But I want to add to this a little bit of, I could be wrong, maybe the psychologists who work with police, etc. forces are developing psychotechnologies that are more sophisticated than I give them credit for. But I doubt it somehow, because this thing just keeps on happening. And there was another one a few months ago. The story I found was more than 10 years ago. And by the way, the black cops in New York, they have a union of their own, and whenever something like this happens, they make a fuss and they protest and they say that the training should be improved. And the police department says we're already doing the very best we can on the training. So what I wanted to give here was just some examples of how you can make the description of the person more video descriptive. Yeah, I guess I adopted that term now rather than ordinary descriptive image. You know, I could give you as a task, but it would drive you crazy, just to listen to people's conversations and notice how much of their conversation when they're describing what happens to them is like completely incomprehensible at the onset of it. It's not a description. We'll give you some examples. He looked suspicious. Okay, well, no he didn't. He had narrowed eyes. So narrowed eyes can can perhaps be interpreted as suspicious. You know, when the border guard looks at you with a pair of eyes, it's probably suspicious. Or maybe he's trying to recover from last night. Can't really be sure. Or he looked puzzled. Or you say to someone, "You look puzzled." And they go, "Yeah, really? Why do you say that?" And you say, "Well, you're squinting." Okay, well, yeah, but I always squint. I'm Mr. Squint. That's what they call me. Or you could say to someone, "You seem very anxious today." And they'll go, "Anxious? Anxious? Who, me? I wasn't anxious until you told me I was." And so it's the tight lips. It's the tight lips. Or maybe it's in the voice. Or, "My grandmother's looking very burdened today." I ask her, "Safta, what's the burden?" And she goes, "Burden, what Narishkeit? What are we talking about? I'm not burdened, I'm an old lady." Slumping, shoulders rounded. Angry? Why are you so angry? Why are you so angry? Why are you so angry? Well,
Because you keep asking me that damn question, Horowitz.
right, so red face, flared nostrils. Right? Angry voice, loud staccato voice. I'm giving you the video things in the right-hand column as alternatives to the left-hand column. If you do it yourself, I won't have to correct it and hand you back the tasks with 80 instead of an 82. Scared, pale, trembling, embarrassed, flushing, worried, furrowed brow, and it just goes on and on like that.
Could you just go over part 3 one more time?
Yeah, I guess I'll go over with some reluctance because I didn't want to burden you too much with this task. Great. Yes. Okay. I'll give you a simple example. Okay. Simple example. And again, everyone has experienced this. You probably experienced it at both ends of the interaction, but I'll just talk about the victim end. So at the victim end of this interaction, it's 4 o'clock in the morning on Friday night, and the town mills are protesting in front of the U.S. consulate, which is around the block from me. It's 4 o'clock, it's 2 o'clock, it's 3 o'clock, it's 4 o'clock, and those town mills are making very, very loud noise, and they are preventing me from sleeping. And sleeping is very important to me. I decided that when I was 16. There's hardly anything that is more important than that is more important than sleeping. Okay, so on the outside I was about to write noise. On the outside I could call it loud sound. Hey, the minute I've called it noise, okay, this is at the object level, and this is at the 2 levels together, the semantic reaction. I'm calling it noise, and I'm feeling pissed off, okay? And I'm feeling pissed off, my fist is clenching, It's like usually when you see someone with their fist clenched and they're coming at you, you can safely interpret that as to be avoided, but not necessarily. Maybe they're practicing studying the feeling of the clenched fist. Okay, they shouldn't do that. I understand that they have their grievances and all kinds of other people in the world that also have grievances. There's Tamils out there making all that noise and screaming about genocide as if they were only people on the face of the earth that were victims of genocide. Why can't they just pack it up and go home and come back again tomorrow morning? So as I tell myself the story, and I have those feelings, and describe the physical feelings for me, I can notice how perhaps the sound gets louder and louder and more noise-like, and how the feelings get more and more intense, the physical feeling aspect of it, how the physical feelings get more and more intense. So we could call part 3 sort of the vicious circle part. Okay. Now there's always a way out. So a person who is perhaps more enlightened than moi would go, what the hell? I'm not sleeping anyway. I'll go out there and join them. It's only 2 blocks away. Maybe I'll meet some nice people. Right? I didn't do that. Why didn't I do that? Because I am not the type of person who would do that. It doesn't correspond to the story that I tell myself about myself. And that's all there is to it. Believe me. Okay? Any more questions about the past? That just answered my life. Any more questions or comments about, yeah?
So, do you want us to choose person that we know very well?
No. No. Choose a person that you don't know very well, because I don't want to interfere with relationships that are important to you. Yeah.
But for that reason, not.
But for that reason,
Yeah.
yeah. And also, it'll be easier. It'll just be easier to practice. Something that you don't know. Yeah.
In the first task, how should we express our thoughts and observations?
As if they were words, because that's what they are. So if you think that they're not words, translate them into words.
Gotcha.
So it's like, if I were saying this, what would I say? Good question. Because most people think that there's such a thing as a thought that is neither an image nor a word. But like I say, I would like to see some demonstration of that, or hear some demonstration. Okay, anything else? Because if not, I have a little extra time, which is a boon, and I can tell you a little bit more at a higher level of abstraction about what this is all about in terms of consciousness of abstraction. So the consciousness of abstraction that is cultivated in this way is a state of mind. It's a state of mind, and what's interesting about it is that it's a state of mind about all states of mind. So here we have states of mind, and I put them this way because they often are structured like this. Like semantic reaction, reaction to the reaction, reaction to the reaction to the reaction, reaction to the reaction to the reaction. It's not linear, it's multilingual. It's leveled. It's talking about. Now, way up here, if you get as high as you can here, you'll get to a state of mind which is about all of these states of mind, which is consciousness of abstraction. It's the consciousness of all of those preceding states of mind as levels of abstraction, increasingly higher levels of abstraction. The significance of this is that consciousness of abstraction is not something that is maintained apart from all other states of mind. It subsumes them. We could put it this way, that awareness of experience is a higher order of experience. It's not apart from experience. So even though we've got to go to, it might seem a little paradoxical, even though we've got to go to the highest label level in order to formulate these notions of consciousness of abstraction, consciousness of abstraction itself is no mere theory. It is a practice. You could say maybe, In some versions of the structural differential, maybe we could have two levels of the object level, one subsuming the other, so one of which would be awareness. The kind of naked, empty awareness that I talked about before is not a theory. Yeah.
In your languaging, because you keep drawing, like each square is
Yeah.
like a label.
Yeah.
So, from your perspective, where's the blackboard fit into all this? 'Cause to me, it
Blackboard?
seems to me like that would be the top level of abstraction you're talking about is actually around.
Okay. I'll go on with that. I could have said that. I could have done that. But we don't always have a blackboard, and maybe we don't always want to have to visualize the blackboard and think feeling about this one.
It just more reflects the naked awareness.
Yes, it does. And empty naked awareness can be black. Why not? Can be dark. Okay, so I already mentioned that in some Buddhisms, awareness is characterized as naked, empty awareness. Sometimes it's called the open space of the mind, in which all that is going on is going on. And you know, in Dzogchen, if you get the instructions for Dzogchen meditation, you'll be told, you'll be advised to rest in awareness, which again, it surprised me when I came across that, because Korzybski was just telling us to dwell in awareness. And Dzogchen says to rest in awareness. So I'm suggesting that consciousness of abstraction is in a way a kind of higher object level of experience, which contains the lower label and label object levels. Now, there's another term Korzybski uses to relate to this. He says that continuous sound practice is the best way to develop conditionality of response. Conditionality of response. Animals have very few opportunities given to them by their neurology. They have very few opportunities to choose among alternatives. They're not without the ability to choose among alternatives. But the distinctive mark of the human being is a much greater potential, at least, for developing a conditionality rather than a rigidity of response. To conceive of various alternatives, or to image various alternatives and to choose among them. So it's conditionality of response, individually and collectively. So when I say collectively, that gets related to the question of democracy, which seems to be left way out there somewhere. But we're going to get back to it within 2-3 weeks from now. I don't know. If you think of certain decisions to make war that have been made by our leaders in the first war in Iraq, the second war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the first war in Lebanon, the second war in Lebanon, the war in Gaza. And, you know, we could extend the list backwards in time, especially. All you can do is wonder whether the kind of, in my very first lecture I talked about the importance of war as an obstacle to democracy. It's just a question. But I can tell you this, when I was interested in psychoanalysis, I once read a study of presidents of the United States in terms of their early childhoods. And they had a whole bunch of pictures of presidents of the United States, and they were all kind of serious looking, even Kennedy. Eisenhower, as children, they had pictures of the presidents as children, 10 million children. So they were all pretty serious looking, except for Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, you know, since he was a Republican, you probably don't think much of him, since upper Canadians tend to be Democrats for some weird reason. Maybe not so weird. But he was the only 10-year-old who actually had a smile on his face. Don't we want smiling 10-year-olds? And so why am I telling you this? Because according to the psychoanalysts who made this study, Eisenhower was the one president who distinguished himself by avoiding war, by actually taking the trouble to avoid something that could have developed into a major war. I'm sorry, I can't remember the details. Now, if you think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, you know, it was Khrushchev actually who saved the day on that one, not Kennedy.
Castro were fire.
It was Khrushchev, and I guess if we had a picture of the 10-year-old Khrushchev, he could be giggling. Just a thought. But, you know, we can't deal with the question about whether happy childhoods make it easier to develop consciousness and abstraction in later life. I don't know. Yeah.
Not to bring us into a history class, which is one of my other streams, but, I mean, could it be that Eisenhower was intimately familiar with what war is?
So,
Well,
so
yeah.
JFK.
Yes, well, but I mean, yeah, but
That would certainly be part of it, but you know, some people who are intimately familiar with war get to really love war and want more. Mussolini is the best example of that one. Did I mention him before? In World War I, he broke with the socialists because they didn't want to fight in World War I. They were the only socialist party in Europe that didn't want to join the war. So he split with them because he was a war socialist, and that was the origin of fascism. Who becomes a fascist in Italy? A socialist who wants to make war. And when Mussolini went to war, he went and he fought, and he enjoyed fighting, and I think he lost a son in that war, and he was wounded 18 times, and after every wounding he wanted to go back for more, and he was the one who's famous for saying, war is to men what motherhood is to women. Now, what could he have meant by that?
Painful lovely wording.
creation versus destruction.
Yeah, I think so. I think Mussolini meant that all great, sort of in the Hegelian vein, all great new leaps of civilization progress had to be preceded, and war would be the midwife.